It seems like everything that she does is like a level up here intellectually. I'm just a lawyer. So I am going to talk, though, about Indigenous communities as a gateway to a sustainable human future in space. Let's see. So just a quick bit about me. I am a space lawyer. I'm the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. I am also the co-founder and CEO of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. We are a permanent observer to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and so we've been working really hard for the last 5 years to make sure that we do get a new treaty in space, and that treaty is focused not just on resource utilization, but also resource and heritage conservation and preservation. So I'm going to take you back to July 1994. A man named Jeff Bezos started a company called Amazon. Robin Wright is decades away from presiding over the House of Cards and starring in a newly released movie called Forrest Gump. Jeff Gillooly is sentenced to 2 years for attacking ice skater Nancy Kerrigan, and Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, grandfather of Kim Jong-un, and the founder of one of the most totalitarian states on earth, is laid to rest. So July 16th, 1994, started like any other Saturday, until the planet was rocked by a so-called comet train with an explosive force several times more powerful than all of the world's nuclear weapons. It produced towering plumes of debris and hot gas and left a huge black scar. It's been called the biggest explosion in the solar system in hundreds of years. Thankfully, we had ample warning. The explosion was on Jupiter, and as you can imagine, scientists and astronomers were jubilant. It remains one of the most studied events in the history of astronomy, and we're still learning from its effects. While scientists generally agree that Jupiter cannot support life, certainly as we know it anyway, others are not quite so sure. Concerned about the impact the comet collision would have on our galactic neighbors, the people of Green River City, Wyoming, unfurled their welcome mat. In the weeks before the collision, the city dedicated the dirt and gravel runway 7 kilometers from city center as the Great Green River Intergalactic Spaceport. The publicly stated purpose was to welcome Jovians fleeing the carnage on their planet. Whether the result of a tongue-in-cheek ploy to attract tourists, a nascent and prescient effort to attract aerospace business, or simply the brainchild of overexcited science fiction aficionados, the Federal Aviation Administration accepted the grandiose appellation. As such, the location the FAA identifies as 48U remains formally known as an intergalactic spaceport and has the distinct honor of being the nation's first federally recognized commercial spaceport. Sadly, the spaceport never developed, and reports suggest that even the spaceport's sign is now gone. But all is not lost for intrepid intergalactic travelers. There are now 10 fully licensed and at least 7 in the process of being licensed commercial spaceports around the United States alone. And the trend is global. Canada, Sweden, the UK, UAE, New Zealand, Malaysia, the Netherlands, Italy, and Curacao, among many others, either have or are considering the development of commercial spaceports as well. So of course the question is, are these states and nations and communities throwing good money at fanciful illusions of galactic tourism and trade only to end up like our Greater Green River, just a landing strip without a sign? Or are they truly on the threshold of the future, assuring that they are better prepared than their neighbors to welcome the space age? I think you can guess my answer. We are in a space revolution. This is the beginning of a new age. This is a new time. This is the threshold of our future. Space tourism is a deep facilitator of this. We heard earlier about the space billionaires spending a huge bunch, not as much as I thought of their fortunes in space, but it's the people who are buying those tickets who are fueling this. You know, the more tourists we get, the more the costs of space are going to come down. Launch services are growing. We see more and more launch service providers, small satellite launches, large satellite launches, tourism, and the launch market is at an inflection point. The number of space launches has risen steadily over the past 2 decades, with 186 total orbital launches worldwide in 2022. the highest number in a single year, and more growth is coming. Low Earth orbit, LEO, and medium Earth orbit, MEO, satellites, which are less expensive and easier to launch than traditional geostationary or GEO satellites, are a key driver of this growth. They are being launched at a record pace, often in constellations. We've seen that the steady increase over the past decade. A BCG analysis of industry data indicates that there will be at least 24,000 satellites launched from 2023 through 2030. And that figure could reach nearly 40,000, depending on the progress of planned mega constellations in LEO. So space exploration itself is gathering pace as well, with 170 missions projected from 2022 to 2031, more than 3 times the number that launched in the past. There is no doubt that the commercial launch has experienced phenomenal growth over the last decade. The number of orbital-capable launch firms has leaped from a couple to more than a dozen, and the cadence of U.S. orbital launches has moved from monthly to weekly. With this trend accelerating upward on a non-linear curve, that's really good news for satellite operators, the broader commercial space industry, and the U.S. government. However, as multiple new rockets move towards testing, and some to operations, America's limited number of spaceports have become a choke point. We have a spaceport bottleneck. Our modern economy is heavily dependent on the data services and all the other resources of space. World-spanning financial networks use precision timing services provided by GPS satellites to synchronize financial transactions. Literally trillions of dollars of global trade depend on reliable satellite communications. Increasing numbers of people access the internet using bandwidth provided by satellites. This is especially important in the areas of the developing world, a world lacking terrestrial communication networks. Why does the spaceport bottleneck matter? Also because we are seeing an incredible reliance on space even through our U.S. military. The DoD purchases massive amounts of commercially sourced satellite imagery. Commercial synthetic aperture radar, signals intelligence, weather forecasting, and numerous other data services. The bottom line is we are dependent on space. We are dependent on our satellites, and we need to continue to be able to access space. Maintaining these satellites, having that resiliency, that redundancy that we need, and our continuing exploration of space and its resources require that we have the infrastructure to support them here on Earth. Indigenous people in the Amazon, in particular, use satellite data. I think we're going to hear more about that today from Allison. And satellite imagery can also help Indigenous communities monitor the health of their land, ensure that it is being protected, and identify areas that need to be protected from further damage. Dan Hawk started us this morning talking about the importance of remote sensing satellites and how the Indigenous communities around the world can harness them to protect their own resources and further their own economies. So we're seeing that this is not just important for the U.S. economy, for the world economy, but also for the Indigenous communities around the world. All of these activities must start at a spaceport. So satellite launches, space tourism, asteroid mining, the lunar settlement, deep space gateway, Mars settlement, point-to-point suborbital travel, and private space stations. So what am I talking about when I say a spaceport? I love to think of this vision, like out of science fiction, but of course we're a little bit away from there. This was the very first spaceport. Again, an earlier presenter talked about sort of the sketchy past of our rocket history. This is Peenemünde in Germany. So yes, the very first rockets that the humanity developed were used to bomb London. And actually Hitler knew he was developing sort of a game-changing weapon. And as we know, this is the basis of both the US and the Soviet Union rockets programs. These are sort of your traditional spaceports that we could think about. This is Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the Jinquan Center in Shenzhou, China. They have all launched humans into and beyond our orbit, but these are all government-run facilities. So from 1963 to 1980, the US government launched 100% of the Western world's commercial satellites. Cape Canaveral Air Force Base and Vandenberg Air Force Base were the dominant hubs of space launch activity. It was national policy, though, in 1984 to expedite the establishment of commercial launch ranges, so non-governmental spaceports. The Commercial Space Launch Act was required that the United States private sector to provide launch service, required the government to support private sector launch services. And then the money came. The Defense Department was given about $10 billion to support the growth of commercial spaceports, so investing money into the economy to build these spaceports. So the first generation of spaceports that we saw took advantage of that federal infrastructure. So these were Vandenberg Spaceport Complex, Florida, Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport. All three of those were co-located on federal sites, so they didn't have to put a lot of work into it. Those were sites that were there. They were essentially taken over by the commercial entities. The Kodiak Launch Center in Alaska is the first spaceport that was not co-located on federal range. So we're seeing here in the 1980s and early 1990s this sort of slow growth of the commercial spaceport, the private spaceport. And again, they first started out with those on those government facilities. These were generally funded in part by that DoD funding, as well as state funding, and a lot of private funding was included as well. Particularly in Vandenberg, there was a private conglomerate to put that together. Here's my slide on it, sorry. You can see the amount of money that was given in each case. So again, this is not something where it's easy for you to just sort of say, hey, let's build a spaceport. There is a deep investment involved. So the next generation of spaceports came after more formal rules were promulgated by the FAA. I'm a lawyer. I know regulations get really dull. I won't go down in the weeds on them, but which just talks about having a pre-application procedure. It's not easy to get a spaceport license. You have to have, this is the FAA CFR 420 and 433 are the license procedures, and they talk about the hoops you have to go through in order to get that license issued. Once you get it, you have it for 5 years, and then you have to keep re-upping it. And so we think about, again, Dan talked about the SpaceX launch. That was a facility licensed by the FAA, even though it is private and launching only its own rockets. This is the information that you need to give in order to get a license. You need to look at the launch site, tell the FAA what kind of launch vehicle you're doing. You have to talk about foreign ownership. And you have to identify, where you can go from your launch point and so forth. And then there will be these level of reviews. We're seeing a launch site location review, a safety review, a policy review. If you're on the coast, you have to have an agreement with the Coast Guard. If you're inland, you have to have an agreement with the FAA. And of course, you have to look at environmental impacts. And that has been sort of the biggest bottleneck in terms of spaceport licensing. There's, rightly so, very huge concerns about what the rockets will do to the surrounding environment, and a lot of communities actually have come together to oppose licensing of spaceports or the development of a spaceport using the environment. Also, it's more of a NIMBY, not in my backyard, but they will use the environment to prevent that. And we saw that happen in Camden Spaceport in Georgia. So these next generation of spaceports are an illustration of the diversifying use of space. So these are no longer just the government launches. We're seeing reusable launch vehicles, reducing the cost of entry into space, and we're seeing the growth in space tourism and suborbital adventurism. These suborbital vehicles are more likely to require horizontal rather than vertical takeoff, requiring different design and area considerations. So we're seeing more and more horizontal launches, which means we need more land, we need larger sizes for our spaceports. These are the sort of the next generation after those first government co-located on federal lands. We have the Mojave Air and Spaceport, which is the first U.S. facility to be licensed to support reusable launch vehicle missions, the first inland spaceport, and the only private airport in the U.S. with a commercial spaceflight license. We have the Oklahoma Air and Spaceport, one of the longest runways in the United States, Spaceport America in New Mexico, which is the launch site for Virgin Galactic, Cecil Field Spaceport in Texas, the Midland International Air and Spaceport, and the Houston Spaceport. So the future, though, is indigenous. Why is that? Because the uniqueness. Tribal nations can support and harness the space economy. With the unique relationship and stewardship of the land through long traditions, we can change the way launch is conducted. Protection of the environment is natural, not imposed. This is something that's built into First Nations culture. So we don't have to worry so much about these review processes because we will have already this inherent need, this inherent tradition of protecting the environment. This would absolutely signal the advent of a new era in space. Conservation, responsibility, stewardship, not simply exploitation or getting there because we can. Having a spaceport is a huge economic boost. They are not a cash flow generator, but an economic engine. They will provide jobs, infrastructure, tourism. They'll become transportation hubs. They'll have training facilities, cargo facilities. So again, think about the future. It's not just space also, because there's going to be a huge increase in the, increase, it hasn't started yet. When site-to-site travel from one spaceport to another spaceport becomes popular, and it will very soon. We're seeing a lot, 2 or 3 companies working on it already. Spaceports are going to be vital for any community to remain sort of in the track of trade. So it's going to be, if you want to sort of be, it's no longer going to be the airport. It's going to be the spaceport where you can get from Melbourne, Florida to Melbourne, Australia in 20 minutes instead of 22 hours. Indigenous communities can own the process of a spaceport. So we saw after the SpaceX launch, environmentalists and Native American tribes rebuked SpaceX because they were worried about the community. They were worried about the environment. But we now have an example in Australia where Southern Launch partners with the Cunaba Community Aboriginal Corporation to develop a world-class spaceport in Australia. We need to partner together, not work in opposition to each other. In this spaceport in Australia, they're planning frequent launches from this facility to provide direct employment for more than 30 community members and to generate significant revenue for the community through tourism, launch, support, and construction. We have a huge need for spaceports in the United States, and it's even been recognized at the congressional level. The Spaceport Act of 2023 was introduced a couple months ago, and it's interesting because it changes the language of the authorization for the funding from the United States government's transportation needs to the civil, national security, and commercial space transportation needs of the United States. So the need for a spaceport is not just for government use. The government itself recognizes the need for a spaceport for civil and commercial space as well. So this Authorization Act essentially opens up more funding for essentially solely commercial spaceports. So I'd like to sort of compare that to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. We know that the indigenous communities have been able to support themselves and raise a lot of money using gaming and building casinos. We can do the same thing with spaceports. We can subvert's the wrong word, we can work outside of the FAA regulatory system and create a separate regulatory system for spaceports being built in indigenous communities. Because you have the community that's already together, you have a community that's already concerned about the environment, you have a community that can be unified in support, and you have a community that will be able to provide the bodies needed for the construction, the people needed to run it. This is really, the ideal place. And we have communities where, from inland launches, we have the space to have the safety that we need to support those launches. So some considerations, though, when you think about this, and I think the idea of creating sort of a Indigenous or Indian Space Launch Act, I think, or Native American Space Launch Act, I think is going to take a long time. That's not going to happen overnight. But I think that what we can do is, if we can start the process I think that the federal government will follow very quickly. So if we want to start the process, here are some considerations. You need to have a partner. You need to have a purpose. You can't just put up your flag and say, I'm building a spaceport. I know there are a lot of commercial entities within the space community who are already looking to try and find indigenous lands to build spaceports on. We've seen it now in Australia. We've seen it in Canada, in Nova Scotia. And this is a great model to follow. Again, it is not an overnight phenomenon. The spaceport in Canada, I think, took 5 or 6 years of negotiation with the Indigenous community to make sure everybody was comfortable. But what does that produce? It's going to produce an even stronger foundation for that spaceport. And you need an anchor tenant. Again, we need to work, and this is a really great way for the space community to engage with the Indigenous community and bring them, harness their all of these capabilities together. There's no reason that we're not doing this right now. And also global ties. It would be phenomenal to strike up a partnership, for example, with the spaceport in Nova Scotia, with the spaceport in Australia. We could have a whole network where the very first point-to-point travel is between spaceports and Indigenous communities. So this is, again, something to think about. The other thing to think about is in addition to sort of the economic boon, this will be a tourist attraction. I mean, we still see people who want to just go to launches and to experience even the training for those launches. And it will bring more and more people into Indigenous communities, and again, build up what we want to see is more partnerships, more collaboration, and more mutual understanding. So when we think about spaceports, I started with our Great Green River and the accepting passengers from Jupiter. We've come a long way, and we have a long way to go. And there's really no reason why that path that we take cannot be unified with the Indigenous community. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. The dialogue has not yet started between Indigenous people and NASA. And when that day happens, Michelle is right. There are Indigenous lands where spaceports can operate. Indigenous people traditionally are caretakers of the land, the caretakers of our airspace. Now because of the orbital debris, we're caretakers of our orbital space. And obviously we have debris on the moon as well, and Mars. How we go about operating in space is one thing, but the idea yet has not come to fruition in NASA yet, and in the federal government, on how they work with Indigenous people to be able to create an Indigenous spaceport. And we're moving in a direction. We're moving in that direction. They're starting to take notice. They're starting to, it's moving slow, but yet I can feel the pressure that it is weighing on them because of the fact that there's a need for more spaceports. But where do you go? Where do you look? We have tribal governments both on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and we have large, vast amounts of land that could support inland launches. And they know it's under radar, so it's just a matter of somebody has to make a decision to approach tribal government and say, look, we need you. And that has not yet happened, but it's coming.